lately Louis has taken to writing poetry in the places to which he travels to visit literary festivals. And he wrote a few in Hong Kong a few months ago. And when he arrived here a couple of days ago, he wrote some new stuff. And you are going to be the first people on the planet to hear Louis' latest poems. So it's a world exclusive coming up right now.
I read standing up, by the way. You get better projection and so on. But I ought to explain that on the airplane coming over, I watched a movie called Centurion, which is a sort of Roman epic set in ancient Britain. And I watched it because there's a friend of mine acting in it. And anyway, there's a character in there called Etain, who is a woman warrior, and she's an implacable killer of Romans. And there was a fabulous line in the film which went, her soul is an empty vessel. It can only be filled with the blood of Romans. And I just loved that line, her soul is an empty vessel. And so my poem echoes that. In my time, I've written quite a few love poems, but recently quite a few of them have been to my children. I have a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old. So this is my poem about having an empty vessel. Sorry, being one. My soul is an empty vessel. With what shall I fill it? With women, with music, with love, with imperishable art? I am weary of all these things, and they are weary of me. I remember when God walked in, stayed for a while, departed, left no card, no number, no forwarding address. I wonder where he went, so pointedly closing the door, making quite sure of the click of the latch, his feet on the gravel, the meticulous click, the counter-click of the gate. I don't blame him. It was me that grew faithless. It was me that told him to leave. My soul is an empty vessel. With what shall I fill it? With music, with women, with money, with pride? And then they come, my son, my daughter. I hear their scrape at the door. I leap from my chair. I gather them in. I tend to their games, their pains, their strange obsessions, their insatiable need to be carried and kissed. The rooms of the house grow bright. The grass of the lawn wakes up. The apple tree braces its boughs. And, this being so, my heart being full, to hell with my empty soul. Thank you.
Louis will read again very shortly. I should just say I like to encourage questions as we go through these sessions, rather than leave it to the end when everybody's desperate to be heard in the last 5 minutes. So be brave and put your hand up. Not right now, but again, there will be a prize for the first person to ask a question, and today's prize. Right. Louis used to be better known for his landscape gardening than for his writing. In some places he probably still is. But Louis is a novelist, poet, playwright, musician, landscape gardener, car mechanic, and part-time Greek. He has been all those things, some of which he continues to be. Now, Louis wrote at least one book, of which you've probably heard, Captain something or other, which is not the book that he really wants to be remembered for, because he thinks his best work is this one, Birds Without Wings. But his latest one is Notwithstanding, this one, from which he's also going to read. But before he does, I'd like Louis to explain a little bit about Notwithstanding and the stories therein, and what notwithstanding actually means. I mean, it sounds like a great name for a village, but why did you choose it?
Well, English villages, and Irish ones too, often have really peculiar, entertaining names. You know, like Piddle Trenthide. And the village I actually grew up in was called Hambledon, but I didn't really want to tell everybody that straight off. And there was a time when I felt that the village had ceased to be itself. In other words, it had not withstood. And so I decided to call the village Notwithstanding. But I was actually mistaken, because the more I went back there, the more I realized that actually it hadn't changed and really was the same. It had just gone through this sort of nasty dip where somebody came up to me and told me not to throw sticks in the pond for my dog in case it frightened the ducks. And somebody moved there from the town and protested about the noise of cockerels in the morning. I thought, well, this place is finished. Yeah. But actually, it's very much the same, and I don't suppose those people have survived there. So that's the reason it was called Notwithstanding. I think it's quite a good name for an English village. But the origin of the book is really with a series of short stories that I began to write about 20 years ago. I had always set my books abroad, and my first three were in Latin America, and my next one was in Greece. I did a children's book in Australia and a book set in Turkey. And I just hadn't written, or didn't appear to have written, very much about where I come from. And the reason for that is that it's very hard to see the place you come from as sort of intrinsically interesting, because it's normal. But one year I went to a Salon de Livre in Pau in the south of France, which is a big book fair. And I met an artist there called Jacques, who said to me, "I just love Great Britain." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because it's so exotic." So I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, everywhere I go in Europe, like France or Belgium or Holland or Germany, they just all seem the same. But he said, La Grande-Bretagne, c'est un asile immense. Great Britain is an immense lunatic asylum. and what I wish I'd said to him but didn't was that you'd never been to Ireland, obviously. But that got me thinking, and when I thought about it a little, I realized that Jacques was absolutely right. I can tell you a bit about some of the people in my village. The lady next door had a house full of animals. She had dogs, cats, hamsters, guinea pigs, rabbits, goats, chickens, the lot. She didn't have carpets on the floor. She had newspapers, and the whole place stank of animal wee, as you can probably imagine. You always tried not to have a cup of tea from her. And every evening she'd call the animals in by going, "Toffee, toffee, toffee, toffee." And they'd all come pouring into the house. She had a 1927 convertible car, I think it was a Swift, with all the wiring hanging out from under the dashboard. And she hardly ever used the brakes, but she just honked the old-fashioned hooter, you know. And everywhere she went, there would be a black and white goat on the back seat. Last year, I found out the reason for this. It was a stud goat, and she was taking it off for mating. So, well, some creatures are born lucky then. The neighbour on the other side, when she got very old, once found that she couldn't get out of the bath, so she just let the cold water out occasionally and topped it up with warm until her son turned up and let her out. There were a couple of spiritualists, two sisters who were spiritualists who lived together in a cottage up a muddy lane, and they'd been spiritualists since after the First World War, when spiritualism understandably went through a huge sort of boom period. And obviously, as the years went by, all their spiritualist friends passed over to the other side. But including one of their husbands, who was called Mac. But as far as they were concerned, Mac was still living with them. They still had the ghost of Mac in the house. And Mrs. Mac would go everywhere with Mac on her arm, chatting to him and visiting his grave together. And it's said that she tried to pay his fare on the bus. There was a man who everybody knew was a spy who worked for MI5 or MI6, but obviously it's extremely rude and inconsiderate to let a spy know that you know that he is one. So that was one subject that was never ever brought up when you were with him. It was a bit like that. Don't mention the war, don't mention military intelligence. I worked for a gardener on a stud farm, which at one time had belonged to Stephen Stills, the rock star. And John the gardener's job had been to grow magic mushrooms and marijuana for Steve Stills. And when Steve Stills sold it, he sold it to the Shah of Iran. The Shah of Iran surrounded it with tank traps. We were saying, Your Majesty, there are very few armoured vehicles in Surrey. But after that, it went to a relatively sane American multimillionaire. John the gardener, he was a great character. He's in one of my stories. He managed to keep a motorcycle and a sidecar all his married life without his wife ever finding out. I got him into terrible posthumous trouble by asking her what had happened to it, because I'd been hoping that I might be able to buy it off her. There was always somebody in the ditch, clearing out the ditches and cutting the hedges. The hedging and ditching man, he was known as. And he'd always, every time you passed him, he'd freshly excavated something. So it was like, he always reminded me of Hamlet, holding something and looking at it. Anyway, I could go on, but this is the kind of village I grew up in, and I dare say every village in the world is fairly similar.
It sounds like the Frenchman was right, doesn't it? But okay, who's first?
My question is, we've had other writers talking about the move from short story writing to novel writing, and whether they're a short story writer or a fiction writer. And you're writing poetry, short stories, children's stories, novels. How do you balance all of those? How do you decide what you're going to do for a particular...
I make no attempt to balance it whatsoever. I just do whatever I feel enthusiastic about. And you can't, for example, suddenly decide to write 100 poems. I mean, life just isn't like that, unless you're Pablo Neruda, who's sort of greatly overproducing in order to get a few nuggets of gold. So you can't really make the decisions. The decisions are made for you by whatever happens to have taken your fancy at the time. And this collection of short stories, it's actually been accumulating over 20 years or so, and I only published it when I actually really, really couldn't think of any more stories to go in it. So it wasn't a question of balancing at all. It was just, well, I must have finished it then. I don't find any contradiction between the various branches of the art, though. Everything I know about poetry, I do put into my prose as well. I could give you a poetic bit from the book to illustrate it if you wanted. The only thing from poetry that you can't put into prose is overt rhyme. Secondly, my chapters in my novels always are short stories. So my novels are put together out of short stories. And the difference between a collection of short stories and a novel, from my point of view, is that the collection of short stories doesn't have just one or two protagonists. It's about lots and lots of people. Otherwise, it didn't feel to me any different writing short stories. These ones, anyway. Does that answer your question?
Stephen mentioned, as he introduced you, that Captain Corelli's mandolin is not your favourite piece. I was wondering why, and do you reread your work?
I don't really. No, I don't read through old things anymore, and partly because it makes me feel sad. I think, gosh, didn't I used to be talented? I sort of think, was that really me? I mean, could I really? Was my vocabulary really that big? And So also, my first three novels in particularly were very much a young man's book. They were full of energy and humour, and I've just travelled such a long way since then that it almost doesn't feel like me anymore. There was another part of your question, wasn't there? What was it?
No, I asked if you reread your work.
Yeah.
No, it was about Captain Corelli and Birds Without Wings.
Yes, that's right. There was another part. I thought there was. I am extremely proud of Captain Corelli's mandolin, don't get me wrong, you know. Obviously, I think it's a masterpiece. But I just think the Birds Without Wings is even better. It's much more ambitious.
The Turkish War and Peace, it's been called.
Ah, the Turkish War and Peace, there you are. So I was always aiming for War and Peace. You know, I had an English teacher at school who told me it was the greatest novel ever written, so I read it. I pretended to have chicken pox and stayed in bed for 2 weeks. And how you fake red spots, I don't know. I probably got psychosomatic ones. But so those huge novels of Tolstoy's, like Anna Karenina, have always been my ideal target. And I was trying to write, with Captain Corelli, I was trying to write my War and Peace, and I felt it didn't quite make it. But with Birds Without Wings, I felt I had made it. Not that I'm saying I'm as good as Tolstoy, but I thought that's as Tolstoyan as I will ever be.
Which brings me to something that a journalist, sitting not too far from where Louis is right now, wrote, that he is the author of a cluster of popularly esteemed literary novels. But the playwright David Hare said the two most depressing words in the English language are literary fiction. So how do you feel about that, having written the Turkish War and Peace?
Well, he can just go and jump in the lake. I don't give a toss what David Hare thinks. I mean, all that amounts to is a statement that he doesn't know how to write it himself, so he's going to diss anyone else who can.
That's why he's a playwright. Louis is also a musician of some note. How important is music in your books, Louis?
In my books, it's always been a theme. I seem to remember talking about it in my first novel, and in my second novel, the protagonist was a musician and composer, and of course, by the time it got to Captain Corelli's mandolin, I was getting more and more obsessed with music. I always have been, really, ever since I was about 17. I mean, when I was 17, the only way you could get a girlfriend was either by having a car or playing the guitar, and preferably both. You know, yeah, and so I initially took up guitar for purely sexual reasons, and it didn't work. But then I got a car later on. So
did that work?
Well, no. What happened was that I fell in love with a blonde French lesbian. So maybe I should have got a motorbike. Anyway, where was I? So yes, but after playing, she was violent as well, unbelievable. When she was drunk, she used to give me a good kicking. Then she went off with the bus conductor, who I was sure was gay. So it was really humiliating. And then I found out later that he actually was. Anyway, aren't people strange? But I'll carry on like this. A few years later, I got in touch with her, and she was living with an extremely large Turkish lesbian who was also violent. And this Turkish lesbian had stamped on her spectacles and posted them through her letterbox. And then later on, I accidentally came across her in New Zealand, where she was living with a violent Maori woman. And I said to Liz, "This is karma. This is payback time. This is life getting revenge on you for how horrible you were to me." But anyway, back to music. Yeah, I said to her, "You still got green eyes." And she said, "Yeah, that doesn't change." But I started playing the guitar, because I suppose, that was just in the air at the time. Everybody was at it. And I steadily fell in love with it more and more. I started off just doing Bob Dylan stuff, like as everyone else did, and then I started learning to play it in a more sophisticated way, and eventually I got interested in playing ragtime, and I realised that ragtime is really rather like a lot of Baroque music. So I started playing Bach, and sort of travelled from being a strummer to being a classical musician in a rather strange way. And when I was writing Captain Corelli's Mandolin, I always did have a mandolin, but when I was writing that book, I played it more and more just to get myself in the mood. And after I finished the book, I never stopped. So I have actually been on the road for the last 6 years doing concerts, and I've really, really had enough.
Now Louis plays in a sort of medieval group of strolling players, like troubadours or something, called the Antonius Players, in which he plays lute, I think, doesn't he?
I've got a guitar that is actually made to look like a lute, so it's a good cheat.
You're a phony.
I'm a phony.
Okay.
But we started off doing medieval and Renaissance music, but nowadays we're mostly doing music from the Balkans, oddly enough, because that's what I love. Dodgy Greek tunes in dodgy rhythms like 7/8. I just love that.
Do you play in Greek restaurants and things like that?
No.
Maybe you should. All right, since we're talking about sex, I just want to read something from it's the beginning of an interview that Louis did with the SCMP, the South China Morning Post, last year. And Louis starts the interview by saying, and I quote, "I really wish I was bisexual," says Louis de Berni. Sorry, what? I just think that gays get far more sex than heterosexuals. They seem to be at it like bunnies all the time, and it seems so uncomplicated but frequent. He says wistfully, "If you're heterosexual, it's also laborious. Well, it is for me. Being bisexual, you'd just be able to pop up. But I just never meet any blokes I fancy." Would you care to comment on that, Louis?
I still haven't met any blokes I fancy. That's all.
Any questions? Can you wait for the mic, please?
On the subject of blonde French lesbians and lesbians and gay bus conductors and bisexuality, one of the things that struck me in Captain Corelli was the very sympathetic incidental figure of homosessuale.
Yes.
And it struck me as being, quite unusual to have in fiction, to have, as I say, a very sympathetically drawn kind of incidental character whose sexuality is not germane to the novel, but it's important in itself and to him. And I just wondered, was there anything that led you to the development of that character in particular?
Yes, oddly enough, it's because I did my degree in philosophy, and one of my tutors got us all together to read Plato's Symposium, where all of these characters get together to discuss the nature of love. And one of the characters, I think it's Alcibiades, proposes that all soldiers ought to be homosexual because then they would fight harder to protect their loved ones and also to impress their loved ones. And then, as now, there was a lot of controversy about having gays in the armed forces. And this was a completely different perspective to the one you sort of would read in the Daily Telegraph or whatever, that soldiers really ought to be homosexuals, and for two very good reasons. So I always remembered this, back from reading this when I was about 19 or 20 years old. And it finally came out in the form of Carlo in Captain Corelli's Mandolin, who actually does try to sacrifice himself for the man he loves. At the firing squad, Carlo forces Corelli behind him, hoping he can protect him from the bullets. So that idea comes from Plato.
So it didn't come from your time at Sandhurst when you were doing officer training?
No. At Sandhurst, they dosed your tea with bromide. The effect of bromide on the male performance is fairly total.
I'm assuming when you refer to the children's story written in Australia, we're talking about Red Dog?
Yes.
It's actually my favourite work of yours, and I didn't realise it was a children's story until today, but that's great. I was just wondering what inspired you about the Pilbara and to write that book.
Okay. I wrote it for 12-year-olds, but my publishers just didn't tell anyone that it was written for kids, so lots of other people bought it. What brought it on many years ago was that I was asked to go and do the festival at Fremantle near Perth, or Freo as you probably call it. And part of the conditions was that I would go and do the first ever literary event in Karratha, which is a mining town halfway up the Western Australian coast, and then the first ever one at Broome, which as you know, is a sort of tropical paradise further north than that. And I did this literary event in Karratha. I found that I was addressing the Rotarians and the Soroptimists. They had the minutes of their meeting first. And I found out later that the Soroptimists were so hated locally that everyone called them the Soroptic cows. The next morning, the hotel manager lent me his ute, or four-wheel drive, as the rest of us call it. Anyway, so he lent me his ute, and I went for a drive around. And on the side of the road near Dampier, which is between, but near you probably know what I mean, near Dampier, there's a bronze statue of a dog on the side of the road. And naturally, I got out to look at this, because you don't often come across a statue of a dog. And it said, Red Dog, 1979, something erected by his friends. And I went back and asked the hotel manager about what the story of the dog was, and he said, well, this is a dog that became really famous for not belonging to everybody, but not belonging to anybody, but belonging to everybody. It did exactly what it wanted, and it travelled all over Western Australia. It used to hitch rides on buses and cars, and even on the train. And he could recognise the sound of your engine. So if he recognised your engine and he wanted a lift, he'd come out in the middle of the road and you'd have to stop. And then he wouldn't get out until you'd taken him where he wanted to go. So, obviously, some people drove around for hours, until they finally found the Dampier salt mine, So that's what gave me the idea. My agent had pestered me for some time to attempt a children's book, and I'd always refused. But I thought this was a really good opportunity. So I went home and I bought a laptop, and I came back a few months later when the weather was a bit cooler, and I hired a ute, and I drove around for a couple of weeks collecting the stories and writing them in the evening. They've just been made into a film, by the way, so which I hope will be out in April.
I hope you like it better than the previous one.
Yes. I've got a part in it. I play a miner. What? Well, the makeup technique for being a miner is that they cover you with sticky stuff and then throw dirt at you.
Chap at the back over there.
Is the process of coming up with a starting line for any of your work difficult or easy for you?
It's difficult. You can spend a lot of time agonising about the first line, but I found the best thing to do is to write the book first and then think of the first line later. Otherwise, you just don't get further than the first line. I've occasionally had fun. The first line of Captain Corelli's Mandolin echoes the first line of my first novel, so I like doing intertextual tricks like that. I've been agonising over the first line of the novel I'm writing now. I came up with the first line and wrote a whole chapter to go with it, and then realised that I didn't need it. So Yes, write the book first, think of the first line afterwards.
Good advice.
When you sell the film rights to one of your books, how much creative control do you retain? Or how much involvement do you have?
Well, nobody realized until J.K. Rowling did it that you could have any artistic control at all. The reason the Harry Potter films are so good is because J.K. had artistic control. In my day, this was unknown. And the wisdom was that you handed it over, winced in advance, and took the money. With Captain Corelli, they did ask me if I wanted to... they did ask me if I wanted to write the script. And I said no, because I was already working on Birds Without Wings, and I didn't want the distraction. The main problem with films is that they're done not by an individual who's in charge, the way that a novel is written. They're done by committees. And so you've got American producers who are providing the money, who are demanding a happy ending for the American market, or they're demanding an abduction by aliens, or they're demanding a car chase. And the whole thing goes off course because of the conflicting demands imposed on you by the people giving you the money. It's very, very unsatisfactory. And Steve has just passed this bit of paper to me. There's a further problem in that I think people making films are determined to make it their own rather than attempt to be faithful to the original. The wisdom is that, films are just a totally different medium from books. And I don't think it is. It's all just stories. But what I feel is that directors are just like dogs. They don't believe that something is theirs until they pissed on it. Have we got any directors here?
Just while somebody thinks of another question, we'll take a picture of you guys. Hang on. Another reading? You want another reading?
When I got to Hong Kong, I managed to write 5 poems straight away in my hotel room. And this is one of them. It's called The Man Who Travelled the World. He travelled the world, restless as rain. There was no continent unexplored, scarcely a city unworthy of days, a night, a week. In all these places he searched for her face, in the streets, in the parks, in the lanes, always pausing to look, listening out for the voice he'd never heard yet always knew he would know. So many lovers, so many encounters, so many years, so many lands. Now he sits by the window, a cat in his lap, an ancient man far off from the place of his birth. And inside that loosening frame of bones beats the same heart as the heart that beat in the young boy who knew she was there and set off to travel the world. He thinks of the children he never had, the ordinary things foregone, the perverseness of such an exhausting, such an impossible search, a whole life squandered on dreams. It begins to rain. He puts on his glasses, looks through the window, watches the girls step by, avoiding the puddles, protecting their hair with their magazines. He fondles the ears of the cat, this ancient man far off from the place of his birth, still looking, still in fief to the same unsatisfied heart as the heart that beat in the young boy who knew she was there and set off to travel the world. Yeah, thank you.
Just keep clapping. Louis de Berni.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. Is there a signing day?